Okay, hi, I'm back for part two for the study guide here. Okay, now the three R's. It's another important part to remember, the three R's. Recovery, recycle, and reclaim. Okay, now it's a good idea to memorize them in order to get an understanding. So recovery is the first stage. That's to remove refrigerant in any condition from the system. But it can also be recycle. That's the next R. Recycle is to clean the refrigerant. The filter, separate the oil from the refrigerant, remove moisture, pass it through filter dryers, etc. And then it can be applied back to the system. But the recovery is just removing. Remember, that's the first R, just to remove it. And then you can put it into an external container. That's the first R. And then recycle, the second R, was to basically kind of clean it up, but not to the point where it's like a brand new. So it's like think of it as a used vehicle. That's the recycle. It's like a used vehicle, still in used condition, but it's still usable. See? Now the last one is reclaim. Reclaim is like basically, think of it like refurbishing, like someone taking a phone and refurbishing, taking all the parts and melting down all the metals and putting it back into a new phone. You know what I'm saying? That's the reclaim. It's close to the level of, it's equal to the level of a new or quote unquote virgin product of the refrigerant. So we got the first R is recovery, which is taking the refrigerant out and putting it into an empty container. Out, clean it, and then we can reuse it. And then reclaim is basically processing it back into a new, just as new state or equal to a new state. So let's see here. We got recovery devices, refrigerant recovery and recycling equipment manufactured after, there's a key date, November 15th, 1993, must be certified and labeled by EPA approved equipment testing organizations to meet EPA standards. So the equipment, let's repeat this again, refrigerant recovery and recycling equipment manufactured after November 15th, 1993. So November 15th, 93 must be certified and labeled by an EPA approved equipment testing organization to meet EPA standards. So there can be a third party EPA approved testing facility. Okay, matter of fact, let's go back to the dates. That's an important date to remember as well. That can be confusing. Because remember, there was another date that was November 15th, which was November 15th, 1995. That's when they made all made it unlawful to vent HFCs. Was in 1995, November 15, 1995, and this here is November 15, 1993, which is when they made it that the equipment for the recovery and recycling had to be labeled by EPA approved equipment. So that might confuse some people. That's why that's important to remember. The November 15th, 93 is when is dealing with the recovery devices. November 15th, 1993, recovery devices. And the 1995, November 15, 1995 is dealing with the unlawful vent of HFCs. Now, okay, let's go back to the recovery devices. You have system dependent, which captures refrigerant with the assistance of the components in the appliance from which the refrigerant is being recovered. And we have two. We have self-contained, which has its own means to draw refrigerant out of the appliance. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so with system dependent, usually uses the compressor the system's compressor to reclaim the to recover the refrigerant from the system. And then with self-contained, usually self-contained have their own compressors to do that type of work for it. Okay, let's see here. Recovery techniques. Now that the recovery is the law. Okay, let's skip that part. Okay, now here, this is an important thing too. When servicing a system, if you discover that 2 or more refrigerants have been mixed in a system, you must recover the mixture into a separate tank. It is important not to mix different refrigerants in the same recovery tank because the mixture may be impossible to reclaim. Recovery only one type of refrigerant into a recovery cylinder. If a strong odor is detected during the recovery process, a compressor burnout has likely occurred. When recovering refrigerant from a system that experienced a compressor burnout, watch for signs of contamination in the oil. After recovering refrigerant, if nitrogen is used to flush debris out of the system, the nitrogen may be legally vented. So keep that in mind. I'm going to repeat that. After recovering refrigerant, if nitrogen is used to flush debris out of the system, the nitrogen may be legally vented. A suction line filter dryer, a suction line filter dryer should be installed to trap any debris that may damage the new compressor. So from the suction line, filter dryer should be installed to trap any debris that may damage the new compressor. I'm gonna go over the cycle, how the system is set up. So we know the suction line is coming from the evaporator, which is from inside the house, and going to the compressor. Okay, the length of the hose between the unit being recovered from the recovery machine will greatly affect the efficiency of the recovery process. Long hose will cause excessive pressure drops, increasing the recovery time, and have potential for increased emissions. Since all refrigerants have a pressure-temperature relationship, the lower the ambient temperature, the slower the recovery rate. So I'm going to repeat that again. Since all refrigerants have a pressure-temperature relationship, the lower the ambient temperature, the slower the recovery rate. So the lower the ambient temperature, the slower the recovery rate. Okay, after completing the transfer of liquid refrigerant between a recovery unit and a refrigerant system, you should guard against trapping liquid refrigerant between the service valves. Okay, now we can talk about leak detection. In order to determine a general area of a leak, use an electronic or ultrasonic leak detector. Once the general area of the leak is located, use of soap bubbles to pinpoint the leak. Dehydration. Okay, proper dehydration procedures through evacuation are important to follow. As every technician knows, the reason for dehydration of dehydrating a refrigerant system is to remove water and water vapors. If moisture is allowed to remain in the operating refrigerant system, hydrochloric and hydrofluoric acids may form. Evacuation of a system is the suggested method of dehydration. It is not possible to over-evacuate a system. So it's not possible to over-evacuate a system. Never evacuate a system to the ambient air without first following proper recovery procedures and obtaining the mandated vacuum level. The factors affecting the speed and efficiency of evacuation are size of the equipment being evacuated, ambient temperature, amount of moisture in the system, the size of the vacuum pump and suction line. In addition, vacuum lines should be equal to or larger than the pump intake connection. I'm gonna repeat that again. In addition, vacuum lines should be equal to or larger than the pump intake connection. The piping connection to the pump should be as short as in length as possible and as large in diameter as possible. System vacuum gauges should be connected as far as possible from the vacuum pump. Measuring a system's vacuum should be done with a system isolated and the vacuum pump turned off. So measuring a system vacuum should be done with the system isolated and the vacuum pump turned off. A system will not hold a vacuum properly has a leak. So if the system, the vacuum, you see the vacuum not going to where it properly should be, then it likely has a leak. A system that will not hold a vacuum properly has a leak. During the evacuation, you may wish to heat the refrigerant system to decrease dehydration time. The dehydration is complete when the vacuum gauge shows that you have reached and held the required finished vacuum. Okay, we're gonna look at the the vacuum, the water vacuum vaporization chart. Let's see later on. Let's see here. Hold up. Okay, so here's the according to the recovery requirements, refrigerant recovery and recycling equipment manufactured after November 15th, 1993. Remember, the 1995 one was the date for the it became unlawful to vent HFCs. So let's keep that in mind. 95 was the it's all about venting. So, from 1993, we're talking November 15, 1993, must be certified and labeled by the EPA and approved equipment testing operations. All equipment must have a low loss fitting. Remember that. All the equipment must have a low loss fitting to minimize refrigerant loss when the hoses are disconnected. And the following is a list of required levels of evacuation for low pressure applications. Using recovery or recycling equipment manufactured or imported before November 15, 1993, it has to have 25 inches of mercury for the vacuum pressure. 25 inches of mercury. Okay, now using recovery recycled equipment manufactured or imported on or after November 15, 1993, it says 25 millimeters of mercury absolute. So 25 millimeters of mercury absolute after November 15th, 1993, it has to have 25 inches of mercury. 1993, November 15th. Okay, let's see. Let's go back. Okay, the following is a list of required recovery levels in inches of mercury for type 2 appliances. Okay, so this is going to break down some of these appliances. Okay, so R22 appliances or isolated components of such appliances normally containing less than 200 pounds of refrigerant. So less than 200 pounds of refrigerant for R22 appliances. Before it says so it says inches of mercury for type 2 appliances. They say 0 before, they say 0 after. Now that was for appliances of less than 200 pounds of refrigerant for R22. For more than 200 pounds of R22 in an isolated component refrigerant, it has to have 4 inches of mercury before and 10 inches of mercury after that 1993 of November 15th. So remember that. For over 200, for more than 200, it has to, before 1993, it has to have a vacuum of 4 inches of mercury. Before and after the date of 1993, November 15th, it has to have 10 inches of mercury. And now it says other high pressure appliances or isolated components of such appliances normally contain less than 200 pounds of refrigerant. So for other high pressure appliances, it would be 4 to 10 as well. Same ratio, 4 before 1993 and then 10 after 1993. Now, other high pressure appliances or isolated components of such applications normally contain more than 200 pounds of refrigerant. Now, this is where it differs now. For other high pressure ones, it's a 4-15 ratio. So 4 inches of mercury before 1993 and 15 inches of mercury after 11/15/1993. And it says for very high pressure appliances, it says 0 inches of mercury and 0 inches of mercury for both, before and after. Appliances can be evacuated to atmospheric pressure 0 psig. If leaks make evacuation in the prescribed level unattainable, the technician must isolate a parallel compressor system in order to recover refrigerant. Failure to isolate a parallel compressor system will cause an open equalization connection that will prevent refrigerant recovery. System-dependent recovery equipment cannot be used on appliances containing more than 15 pounds of refrigerant. So remember that. System-dependent recovery equipment cannot be used on appliances containing more than 15 pounds of refrigerant. So system-dependent means like usually we use those on smaller appliances that got like 5 pounds or less, but those are systems that would use their own compressors for the recovery process to recover the refrigerant from the system. So 15 pounds of refrigerant or less. Now, under the EPA regulations, a major repair means any maintenance, service, or repair involving removal of any or all of the following components: the compressor, the condenser, the evaporator, the auxiliary heat exchanger coils, and pretty much, parts that are more involved or more expensive parts, obviously. Let's see here. Okay, it's going over some other key points here. The filter dryers will remove moisture from the refrigerant in a system, but there is a limit to their capacity. Some systems are equipped with a moisture indicating sight glass. When the sight glass changes colors, the system contains excessive moisture and will need to be evacuated. The filter dryer should be replaced anytime a system is open for servicing. If a strong odor is detected during the recovery process, a compressor burnout may have occurred. When recovering refrigerant from a system that experienced a compressor burnout, watch for signs of contamination in the oil. So I'm going to repeat that again. The filter dryer should be replaced anytime the system is open for servicing. That's first off. If a strong odor is detected during the recovery process, a compressor burnout may have occurred. When the recovering refrigerant from the system that experienced a compressor burnout, watch for signs of contamination in the oil. A crankcase heater is often used to prevent refrigerant from migrating to the oil during periods of low ambient temperature. Refrigerant in the oil will cause oil foaming in the compressor at startup. When evacuating a vapor compressor system, the vacuum pump should be capable of pulling 500 microns 29.90 mercury of volume of vacuum. The more accurate and preferred method of measuring a deep vacuum is in microns. So that's another key thing to remember: 500 microns, or 29 inches of mercury, or 29.90 inches of mercury. So when you're evacuating a vapor compressor system, the vacuum pump should be capable of pulling 500 microns, which is 29.90 inches of mercury of vacuum. Okay, hermetic compressors, it says warning, hermetic compressor motors windings could be damaged if energized when using a deep vacuum. The use of large vacuum pumps could cause trapped water to freeze. So remember, the use of large vacuum pumps cause trapped water to freeze. During evacuation of a system with large amounts of water, it may be necessary to increase the pressure by introducing nitrogen to counteract freezing. So that's another key thing I saw in the test before, is that you can introduce nitrogen to counteract freezing. Nitrogen. Remember that nitrogen, not the hydrogen or any other thing. Remember nitrogen. So repeat that again. The use of large could cause trapped water to freeze. During the evacuation of the system with large amounts of water, it may be necessary to increase the pressure. Remember that, I think that increases the temperature as well, by introducing nitrogen to counteract freezing. The source of most non-condensables is air. Non-condensables will cause higher discharge pressures. So the source of most condensable of most non-condensables is air. The non-condensables will cause higher discharge pressure. Where there is a risk of freezing, charging of an R12 refrigerant system should begin with vapor from the vacuum level to a pressure of approximately 33 psig, followed by a liquid charge through the liquid line service valve. Refrigerant. So let's repeat that again. Where there's a risk of freezing, charging of R12 refrigerant systems should begin with the vapor from a vacuum level to a pressure of approximately 33 psig, followed by a liquid charge through the liquid line service valve. This is also a proper method of charging systems that contain large quantities of refrigerant. Okay, and this is another thing here. Refrigerants R12, R11, and the HFC 134A are categorized as A1. So remember that those are categorized as A1. We're talking about R12, R11, and 134A. A1. I'm gonna say that one more time. Refrigerant R12, which is a CFC, R11, which is a CFC, and HFC R134A are categorized as A1. Let's see, next thing. Let's go to the next thing here. I'm gonna go back over the cycle here of this thing here. I'm gonna start coming from the compressor. When I explain the system here, I'm gonna go from the compressor, which is the high side. Remember, the high side is dealing with the components that's normally at high pressure, dealing with the higher pressure side dealing with outside. Those are normally the components you see outside. And then you have the low side, which is normally inside the facility or inside the house. So we got the compressor, and I'm going from the compressor. Remember, the compressor superheats the refrigerant and sends it into the condenser. This is the little device you see outside, you know, in most people's AC systems. That's the condenser. The compressor is normally located somewhere inside the condenser as well, but we call it separate components. The condenser coils are the coils is inside the condenser. So the compressor is attached to what we call the discharge line, and that superheats the refrigerant into the condenser, which the condenser fan blows the ambient air across those condenser coils with that superheated refrigerant, displacing that heat from the refrigerant into the air. And at this point, it's vapor. The discharge line, the refrigerant is in a vapor state going into the condenser, and it starts to saturate, become a saturated state where it starts turning into a liquid in the condenser. Leaving the condenser now, it's going into what we call the receiver. Some systems might not have a receiver, but the receiver stores a lot of liquid refrigerant that's subcool liquid refrigerant, and it might go through a filter dryer before leaving and going into the metering device. And the metering device is the start of the low side, because after leaving the metering device, the refrigerant goes into the evaporator, and it goes into the evaporator as a liquid form, and the evaporator fans, the fans inside the evaporator, blow the room temperature air across those coils in the evaporator, which pretty much absorbs the heat from the room into the refrigerant, turning the refrigerant into a vapor, where it comes out back to the discharge line to go back into the compressor. So I'll repeat this again. It goes from the compressor to the discharge line. The discharge line is it's just the line between the compressor and the condenser. So from the compressor, it goes to the discharge line, to the condenser, from the condenser to the receiver, if you have a receiver, to the metering device. After going through the filter dryer, goes to the metering device and into the evaporator, and then to the suction line, which is between the evaporator and the compressor, and back to the compressor. I'm gonna say that one more time. The compressor, starting from the compressor to the discharge line, to the condenser, to the receiver, to the filter device, to the metering device, to the evaporator, and to the suction line, and back to the compressor. And one way to look at things, because this was something that confused me as well, is you gotta keep in mind that like refrigerants like R22, they have a boiling point that's lower than water. So when you think of like boiling and a liquid turning into a vapor, we think of water and we think of steam. Steam normally that has to be really hot before water starts turning into a vapor. But with refrigerant like R22, they have a very low boiling point compared to water, where water has to be very hot to boil. R22 boils at 40 degrees, which is a very cool temperature. So at a cold, what we might consider a cold temperature to us, that R22 is boiling. That's why it's able to turn into a vapor as it goes into the evaporator as a liquid, and able to turn into a vapor just from the room temperature heat being applied to it with the evaporator fans. Okay. The next part. Let's see here. Okay, let's talk about this receiver, because the receiver is another important thing on the test I saw. The receiver acts as a surge tank. Once the subcooled liquid exits the condenser, the receiver receives and stores the liquid. The liquid level in the receiver varies depending on whether the metering device is throttling open or closed. Receivers are usually used on systems with the thermostatic expansion valve, TXV or TEV, is used as a metering device. So that was, like you said, repeat that again. Receivers are usually used on systems in which a thermostatic expansion valve is used as a metering device. There are different types of metering devices. So when they're using a thermostatic expansion valve, TXV or TEV, whatever you want to call it, is used as a metering device. The subcooled liquid in the receiver may lose or gain subcooling depending on the surrounding temperature of the receiver. If the subcooled liquid is warmer than the receiving surroundings, the liquid may reject heat to the surrounding and subcool even more. If the subcooled liquid is cooler than the receiver surroundings, heat will be gained by the liquid and the subcooling will be lost. A receiver bypass is often used to bypass liquid around the receiver and route it directly to the liquid line and filter dryer. This bypass prevents subcooled liquid from sitting in the receiver and losing its subcooling. So let's repeat that again. A receiver bypass is often used to bypass liquid around the receiver and route it directly to the liquid line and filter dryers. This bypass prevents subcooled liquid from sitting in the receiver and losing its subcooling. A thermostat with a sensing bulb on the condenser outlet controls the bypass seminoles valves by sensing liquid temperature coming to the receiver. If the liquid is subcooled to a predetermined temperature, it will bypass the receiver and go to the filter dryer. So if the liquid is subcooled to a predetermined temperature, it will just bypass the receiver altogether and go straight to the filter dryer, to the metering device. Okay, now let's talk about the liquid line here. The liquid line transports high pressure subcooled liquid to the metering device. In transport, the liquid may either lose or gain subcooling depending on the surrounding temperatures. Liquid lines may be wrapped around suction lines to help them gain more subcooling. Liquid/suction lines heat exchangers can be purchased and installed in an existing system to gain subcooling. So let's read that again. The liquid line transports high pressure subcooled liquid to the metering device. And the metering device is again where the low side starts, but that's where the pressure is dropped at the metering device. So before this, high pressure subcooled liquid. So and it transports the liquid may either lose or subcooling depending on surrounding temperatures. The liquid line may be wrapped around suction line to help them gain more subcooling. The liquid suction line heat exchanger can be purchased and installed in an existing system to gain subcooling. The metering device. The metering device meters liquid refrigerant from the liquid line to the evaporator. There are several different styles and kinds of metering devices on the market with different functions. Some metering devices control evaporator superheat and pressure, and some even have pressure limiting devices to protect the compressor at heavy loads. The metering device is a restriction that separates the high pressure side from the low pressure side. In a refrigeration system, the compressor the metering device is a restriction and separates the high pressure side from the low pressure side in a refrigerant system. The compressor and the metering devices are two components that separate pressure in a refrigerant system. The refrigerant system, the restriction in the metering devices cause liquid refrigerants to flush to a lower temperature in the evaporator because of the lower pressure and temperature. Now the evaporator, like the condenser, acts as a heat exchanger. Heat gained from the product load and outside ambient travels through the sidewalls of the evaporator to vaporize any liquid refrigerant. The pressure drop through the metering devices causes vaporization of some of the refrigerant and causes lower saturation temperatures in the evaporator. This temperature difference between the lower pressure refrigerant and the product load is the driving potential for heat exchange to take place. The last pass of the evaporator core acts as a superheater to ensure all liquid refrigerant has been vaporized. This protects the compressor from any liquid slopover, which may result in valve damage or diluted oil in the crankcase. The amount of superheat in the evaporator is usually controlled by a thermostatic expansion type of metering device. Okay, the suction line liquid evaporator pressure. The suction line transport low pressure superheated vapor from the evaporator to the compressor. It's the end of the evaporator. It's leaving the components in the suction line, such as a suction accumulator, a crankcase regulator,